Humans tuning in. Humans tuning in. Oh my goodness, I am so glad that you are looking into the TV set and I'm on the other end of it. You know why? This is the day in which you get to meet one of my good friends who tells stories. Yeah, that's right. She's here all the way in Hawaii, Honolulu, on ThinkTech Hawaii, in order to tell you stories. Her name is Anne Shimojima, and she's going to tell it all. She's going to talk her head off. She's going to reveal the stories on the tip of her tongue. She's all the way from Chicago, and we're glad to have her. You at home, please clap and welcome Anne Shimojima to the studio. Hey!
Oh, thank you, Jeff.
Can you hear that rousing applause?
Yes, I can.
Anne really is a full-time, man-oh-man storyteller who came from Chicago to Honolulu to be part of the Talk Story Festival.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm very glad that you came. And we're very glad to bring her into the studio so that you at home, who didn't come to the Talk Story, well, maybe you did, but you don't have to go anywhere else, but just sit back and let Anne take you on a magic carpet ride on the tip of her tongue, tails into your ears, called, what are we going to do first?
Oh, we're going to do a story from Germany.
Oh, yeah. Das ist gut. Okay, everybody, lean forward. Let's take it away. Here's the first story from Anne Shimojima.
Thank you. This story is called The Hedgehog and the Hare. It goes like this. One morning, Mr. Hedgehog woke up early. He decided to go for a walk in the garden. There he was walking up and down the rows of the vegetables. The sky was blue, the sun was shining, the breeze was warm, and Mr. Hedgehog was feeling good. When who should he meet but Mr. Hare? The hare said, "Good morning, Mr. Hedgehog." The hedgehog said, "Good morning, Mr. Hare." The hare said, "Mr. Hedgehog, what are you doing out so early this morning?" The hedgehog said, "Well, I'm just out for a walk in the garden." The hare said, "Walk? Walk on those short, stubby legs?" And he laughed and laughed at Mr. Hedgehog's legs. Well, Mr. Hedgehog's feelings were hurt. He liked his legs. They got him where he wanted to go, didn't they? Well, those two animals started arguing and fussing and fighting about who had the nicest legs and who had the longest legs and who could walk the farthest and who could run the fastest. Before long, those two animals had made a bet. Each animal bet he could win a race from one end of the field to the other. They bet a gold coin. Well, Mr. Hare went home to have breakfast and get ready for the race. And Mr. Hedgehog went home and told this story to his wife, Mrs. Hedgehog. She said, "Are you crazy? Everyone knows the hare is the fastest animal around. There is no way you can win a race against the hare." The hedgehog said, "Ah, but I have a plan, and you're going to help me. I know that the hare is going to get ahead right away. Mrs. Hedgehog, I want you to hide in the bushes at the other end of the field. When the hare comes running up, you jump out of the bushes and say, 'Hello, Mr. Hare, here I am already.' And because you look exactly like me, he'll think you are me. He'll think I have won the race." She liked that plan. So at noontime, Mr. Hare and Mr. Hedgehog met at one end of the field. It was once, twice, thrice, and off they went, and the hare got ahead, and when he got to the other end of the field, Mrs. Hedgehog popped out of the bushes. She said, "Hello, Mr. Hare, here I am already." The hare said, "I can't believe this. We must run this race again." So it was once, twice, thrice, and off they went, and when he got to the other end of the field, Mr. Hedgehog popped out of the bushes. He said, "Hello, Mr. Hare, here I am already." The hare said, "This is incredible. We must run this race a third time." It was once, twice, thrice, and off they went. And when the hare got to the other end, Mrs. Hedgehog popped out of the bushes. She said, "Hello, Mr. Hare, here I am already." They ran that race 73 times. In the middle of the 74th race, the hare fell over exhausted. He said, "Mr. Hedgehog, I don't know how you have done it, but you have won the race." And he handed over a gold coin. Now, there are two things we can learn from this story. One, don't make fun of other people. And two, if you're a hedgehog, always marry a hedgehog. Now that story comes from Grimm's fairy tales. And I believe it's the only Grimm's fairy tale with morals.
Yeah. Are you going to tell us another story, Anne?
Well, I am.
I'm so glad.
And here we go. Let's see. Oh, this story is from Japan. And Japan is the country that my grandparents came from to the United States over 100 years ago. And so this story is called The Golden Crane. Once in Japan, a long time ago, there was a small village by the sea. And in that village, there lived a boy named Toshio. Now, Toshio was not like the other boys in the village. He could not hear, and he could not speak. He lived with his father, who took good care of him and taught him well. Toshio was a bright boy, and all the villagers knew him and helped him, and so he did very well. Now, Toshio's father was a fisherman, and he fished all night long. And in the morning, Toshio would help him to bring in the catch. But one night, his father took the boat far out to sea, and a great storm arose, and the winds howled, and the rain poured down. And in the morning, Toshio's father did not come back home. Toshio stood by the side of the sea all day long, staring out at the water, looking for any sign of his father's boat. But his father never returned. And Toshio stood there in the early evening hours, staring out, and an old man came down from the mountains. Everybody called him Oji-san, which means uncle. Oji-san was a friend of Toshio's, and he knew that Toshio was alone. And so he came up to the boy and he said, "Toshio, you come home with me. You can live with me." And because the boy could not hear him, he took Toshio by the hand and led him up the mountain to his house. And from that day, Toshio lived with Oji-san. Now, Oji-san was a fisherman too, and he also fished all night long. And in the morning, Toshio would go down and help the old man bring in the catch. But sometimes, Toshio would wake up extra early, and he would go up the mountain to where there was a temple, and he would wait there in the dark, early morning hours, and he would wait for the sun to rise. The sky would be black, and then red, and then orange, and then gold, shining gold, and a flock of golden cranes would fly overhead, their wings beating in the morning air. And Toshio would throw up his hands as if to say, "Oh, birds, you are so beautiful." One morning, Oji-san returned back to shore to find Toshio waiting for him. The boy was obviously upset, and because he could not speak, Toshio grabbed the old man's hand and began to pull him up the side of the mountain all the way to the temple and pointed to the ground. And Oji-san looked down, and there was one golden crane lying in the pathway, its wing injured. He bent down and carefully, slowly slid his arms under the bird. The bird did not fight him. He carried the bird home and laid it before the fire. He mixed up a paste of healing herbs and carefully spread it over the injured wing. Toshio knelt beside the bird. He held out a piece of fish, but the bird would not eat. Every day Toshio knelt beside the bird. He stroked the bird's feathers. Finally, on the third day, the bird ate a piece of fish. Every day he ate a little more. He was growing stronger and stronger, but by then, stories of this beautiful bird had begun to spread throughout the village. The people began to come one by one, and then in groups larger and larger, to see this rare bird. One day, a wealthy merchant came. He wore robes of fine silk and rode a great white horse. He carried in a metal box, lifted the lid, and there were gold coins that shone almost as brightly as the bird itself. The merchant offered Oji-san all this money in exchange for the bird. But Oji-san shook his head. "No," he said, "I cannot sell you this bird. This bird does not belong to me." And he sent the merchant away. A few days later, the lord of the region came. He knelt beside the bird and thought of the golden cage he would build to hold it. He offered to make Oji-san head man of the village in exchange for the bird, but Oji-san said, "No, I cannot sell you this bird. It is a wild animal. It must be free." And he sent the Lord away. Every day the bird was growing stronger. Soon it would be able to fly. But by then, stories of this rare bird had spread all the way to the emperor. And the emperor decided that such a rare bird should only belong to an emperor. And he sent a message. He would come to the village himself, the emperor himself, in 2 weeks' time at sunrise to collect the bird. Oji-san knew he must obey. No one ever dared say no to the emperor. The village went into a frenzy of excitement to think the emperor was coming to their tiny village. Everything was cleaned and made ready. And in 2 weeks' time, on the appointed day, in the early, dark morning hours, the entire village lined up on one side of the road. Toshio and Oji-san stood there. The golden crane lay beside them in the road. And the people listened, and in the distance they could hear the sound of drum beats coming closer and closer. And they looked down the road and they could see the rows of the soldiers carrying the banners, and then the emperor himself riding his huge black horse. And then at that moment, the sun began to rise, and the sky changed from black to red to orange to gold, shining gold, and the flock of golden cranes flew across the sky, and then the flock turned and flew straight towards the village, the wings beating, shining so brightly in the morning sun that people had to close their eyes. The soldiers turned away. The emperor had to turn his head. All they could hear was the sound of beating wings, and then a boy's voice crying aloud, "Oh, birds, you are so beautiful." Gradually, the sound of wings faded. The people opened their eyes. The soldiers looked over. The emperor looked. But the golden crane was gone. And gone too were Toshio and Oji-san. They had been carried by the flock of golden cranes into the light of the rising sun.
We'll be back.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel, founder of ThinkTech Hawaii. We are a digital media nonprofit that covers things that matter to tech, energy, diversification, globalism, and progress for our state, the state of Hawaii. We broadcast on community television and on Oceanic Cable Channel 16. We also stream our shows and interviews live on the internet as both radio and video, and of course we post them here on YouTube. We collaborate with the Hawaii Venture Capital Association to present monthly luncheon programs on subjects of interest to the business community. And we write for the Honolulu Star Advertiser. ThinkTech works hard to raise public awareness in Hawaii. Check out our website, thinktechhawaii.com, and come to our YouTube channel, ThinkTech Hawaii. We hope you support our mission and that you like our work. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
Aloha, I'm Maria Kashem of ThinkTech Hawaii, and I want to tell you about our ThinkTech talk shows. If you didn't know it, ThinkTech streams video and audio for all of its shows live on the internet from 2 to 5 p.m. every weekday afternoon, and we replay them all night long on ustream.tv. Visit thinktechhawaii.com for our live stream and YouTube links. Raise your awareness on ThinkTech. I'm Maria Kashem, and I'll see you there.
Hi, welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii with Anne Shimojima, who's telling us stories. Now, Anne, when I asked you to come on this show, you said, huh. And I said, don't tell stories that you told at the Talk Story Festival. Tell different kind of stories. And you went, huh. Is it true?
That's true.
That's true. And you went into your bag and you pulled out like a binder full of like 3,000 pages, right? Well, every line had a story on each of the pages, and you went,
My database. My story database.
Story database. And she went, check it, this one, this one, this one. How many of you at home have a story database that you can reach on and at the drop of a hat pull out an hour worth of stories? I don't. Anne does. She's got a few more stories for us right now, right?
I do.
What's coming up?
A story from China.
Hi. Anne Shimojima, take it away.
Thank you. The story is called The Comb. Once in China, a long time ago, there lived a farmer. He lived with his wife and his wife's mother, his mother-in-law, and they lived happily together on their small farm. Now, they were not poor. They always had plenty to eat, but they led very simple lives. They didn't own a lot of things. They didn't need a lot. Well, they lived only a few days' walk from the big city. The farmer had lived there his whole life, and he had never been to the big city, and he had always wondered what it was like there. And so one day he decided he was going to go, and he told his wife, and he asked her if she wanted him to bring anything back for her as a gift. She thought for a while, and she said, "Oh, my husband, I would like you to bring me a comb." Now, I don't mean the kind of comb that you use to comb your hair. I mean a decorative comb that you wear in your hair. She did not have a comb like that. And the farmer was puzzled. He had never seen such a thing. He didn't know what it looked like, and he thought, I will not remember what this is. How can I remember? His wife said, "Come with me, husband," and she took him outside and pointed up to the sky at the moon, which hung there like a silver crescent in the sky. She said, "My husband, a comb looks like that. Wherever you are, just look at the moon. You'll be able to see it wherever you are, and it will remind you of what I've asked you for." Well, this seemed like a good idea, and so he packed his things, said goodbye to his wife and mother-in-law, and began his long walk down the road. He walked for several days, and at last he came to the big city. Oh, it was so wonderful. He had never seen so many buildings. He had never seen so many people. He had never seen so many stores selling so many interesting things, or tasted so many delicious different foods. Oh, he had a very interesting time for a number of days, a week or two, and finally he realized it was time to return home. But he was supposed to bring his wife a gift. And what was it? He couldn't remember. Something about the moon. So he went to a shop and told the shopkeeper, "I must bring a gift home for my wife, and come with me." And he said, "It looks like the moon." And he pointed to the moon, and there was the moon hanging in the sky, round and full like a dinner plate. "Ah," said the shopkeeper, "I have just the thing." And he came out with a round mirror. He said, "Take this. Women love these." Well, the farmer took the mirror, a little puzzled, and he looked into it, and he saw a man looking back at him. He had never seen a mirror. They did not own mirrors in his house. Well, the shopkeeper said, "Women love these," so he bought the mirror and put it in his sack, and he started on the long walk home. After several days, he arrived back at his house. His wife ran out to greet him. Oh, they were so happy he had arrived safe and sound back again. She and her mother cooked a big feast. Oh, they celebrated, and he told them story after story of all the wonderful sights he had seen. Then his wife said, "My husband, did you remember my gift?" Oh, yes. He opened his sack, took out the mirror, and handed it to her. She was a little puzzled, and she took the mirror and she looked into it. Oh, no! Oh, she began to cry and wail. "Oh, husband, how could you do this to me? How could you be so cruel? Have I not been a good wife to you? Have I not served you faithfully all these years? Oh, how could you do this?" She made so much noise. Her mother came running into the room. "Daughter, daughter, whatever is the matter?" "Oh," said the wife, "my husband has gone to the big city and brought home a new wife. Look." The mother-in-law took the mirror in her hands, stared into it, and said, "Well, if he had to bring home a new wife, why did he bring home such an ugly old hag?" Well, the farmer explained to them what a mirror is. Eventually, his wife did forgive him, but it was a long time before the farmer ever went back to the big city again.
I like it. I feel like I'm in 3rd grade and the substitute teacher that I always dreamed about is suddenly coming true. Isn't it just like having someone give you a feast, like take you on a journey, give a story to somebody is like take my imagination and just fly away like those cranes, huh?
Yeah. And you know, sometimes I would tell stories to my students at school and they would stare at me and they would look straight at me and I would know they didn't see me. Did you ever, you've probably gotten that look to your storytelling listeners.
Yes.
I knew that they were off somewhere in their imaginations and it was a beautiful thing to see.
So take us somewhere else, Anne. What do you got next?
A story from Japan. For many years, this was my signature story. This might be my favorite Japanese story.
Ooh, I can't wait to hear it. Everybody, move a little closer to the TV set, huh? Here's Anne Shimojima with a story from Japan. What's it called?
The Crane Wife. This is a classic old Japanese folk tale. Once in Japan, a long time ago, there lived a poor peasant named Yoshio. He lived all alone in the home his parents had left for him when they had died. On a cold and wintry day, Yoshio was walking down a snowy path when he looked to the side and he saw a large trap. And caught in the trap was a great white crane, its feathers fluttering as it tried to break free. "Oh, poor bird," said Yoshio, "you will die if I do not help you." He walked over to the trap, bent down, and a man came running up. He said, "What are you doing? That's my bird." Yoshio said, "I was only trying to help it. Here, take this money. It's all I have. Sell the bird to me." The man was satisfied, and after he left, Yoshio bent down over the trap again, and he freed the bird. He stepped back and watched as the bird rose into the sky. It circled over his head 3 times and flew off toward the mountains. And Yoshio watched it until it was so small he could see it no more. And then he turned and he went home. Late that night, he heard a knocking at his door. Who could it be so late? When he slid the door open, he was amazed, for there, standing at his doorstep, was a beautiful young woman, shivering with cold, for she was wearing only a thin kimono. "Please, sir," she said, "I've lost my way. May I come in and sit by your fire?" Quickly, Yoshio invited her in. She stayed that night and the next 3, for it snowed so hard she could not leave, but by then he did not want her to leave. She was so beautiful, so gentle. He had fallen in love with her that very first night. One day she smiled at him. She said, "Yoshio, why don't we marry?" And so they became husband and wife, and Yoshio was happier than he had ever been. The woman was kind, and his formerly dark house seemed to be filled with light. But they were very poor. He had little to begin with, and now there were 2 mouths to feed. One day she came to him and said, "I see that the other wives in the village have looms with which to weave cloth. I know how to weave. I could weave for you." Now, Yoshio did have a loom in the house, for his mother had been a weaver before she had died. So he set up the loom in a back room, and before his wife went into the room, she said, "Now, you must promise me you will not look at me while I am weaving." Thinking she needed to be alone to concentrate on her work, he gave his promise. She went into the room and closed the doors. He could hear the sound of the loom, tong-kada, 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 tong-kada. For 1 whole day and 1 whole night, the sound of the loom never stopped. She didn't eat or sleep. When she finally appeared the next morning, she was pale and weak, but in her hands she carried a bolt of fabric more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. He took the cloth in his hands. The color seemed to glow with a lustrous light. He picked up one corner. It was as light and as delicate as a feather. He took the cloth to town and sold it for a great deal of money, and they lived together well for a while. But the winter dragged on and on. There was no work to be had. He didn't want to ask her to weave again, but one day she said, "I'll weave just one more time, but this will be the last. And remember, you must not look at me while I'm weaving." She went into the room. He could hear the sound of the loom for 2 days and 2 nights, and when she finally appeared, she was so weak she could barely stand. But the cloth in her hands was so beautiful, it took his breath away. This time, he took the cloth to the lord of the village, who gave him 10 gold coins. Now, they lived together very well. But only a few days later, the Lord sent a messenger, and the message was this: "You have sold me the finest cloth in all of Japan. I want another piece like it, and if you bring it to me, I'll give you 100 pieces of gold." As the messenger spoke, Yosho could see the gold coins dancing before his eyes. But when he told his wife, she was puzzled. Why would anyone want that much money? So he said no more. But from that day, all he could think about was the gold. Whether awake or asleep, all he could see were those gold coins shimmering before his eyes. He seemed so unhappy that finally she said, "Very well, I'll weave just one more time, but this will be the last. And for the sake of heaven, do not look at me while I am weaving." She went into the room. Yosho rubbed his hands together with anticipation and sat down to wait. Tonkara, 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 tonkara. For 3 whole days and 3 whole nights, the sound of the loom never stopped. And Yosho, sitting there, began to wonder. Why did she always look so pale and weak each time she wove? How could she make such beautiful cloth when she never seemed to buy any thread? What was going on behind those doors? And the more he sat, the more he wondered, until finally he couldn't stand it anymore. He got up, forgetting his promise, walked to the doors, pushed them aside, and froze with horror. For the sight that met his eyes was not human. It was a great white crane sitting at the loom, its chest smeared with blood. For with its beak, it was pulling out its own feathers and placing them in the loom. Yosho gave a cry and fell away from the doorway in a faint. When he opened his eyes, there beside him was a bolt of fabric, the white cloth shining white upon white upon white, with a thread of bright crimson running through it in a pattern as delicate as tears. And he heard a voice. "I had hoped that we could live together forever, but now that you have seen me as I truly am, I can no longer stay in the world of humans. I am the crane you rescued that day in the snowy path. I came to repay your kindness. I loved your generous heart, but now I must leave." Yosho stumbled outside just in time to see a great white crane rising into the sky. It circled over his head 3 times and then flew off toward the mountains, and Yosho watched it until it was so small he could see it no more. Now that's a sad story.
That's a sad one.
Hi, I'm Steve Petranek, editor of Hawaii Business Magazine, and I'm going to be part of Newsmorphosis 3, a look at online news in Hawaii. And along with me there will be Patty Epler of Civil Beat and HuffPost Hawaii. Malia Zimmerman of Hawaii Reporter, Jared Kuroiwa of KHON, and moderating us all is Howard Dykes of Hawaii News Now. If you want to know how Hawaii it gets its news now and will be getting it in the future, you need to be at Newsmorphosis 3. That's at 11:30 on October 24th at the Plaza Club. See you then.
Well, we're back with Anne Shimojima. What a storyteller. Can you imagine having like that many stories rolling around in your head? Do you talk to yourself in your night sleep?
No, but remember, I've been a storyteller for over 30 years.
That's a long time to develop a lot of stories.
Yes, yes, it's a long time.
How did you begin?
Well, let's see. I was a elementary school librarian, or as we say, elementary school library media specialist for 35 years. And so I first took a course in storytelling in library school. And when I started working and started telling stories to my students, of course, I was immediately hooked. Because you have their attention, you have them in the palm of your hands. It's a wonderful educational tool, and your students love the stories, and they love you. So I told stories, my years of teaching, brought it into the curriculum wherever I could, and eventually became a professional storyteller.
Well, and you've been doing that for quite a while. Adult classes?
Yes, I've taught graduate courses in storytelling. I've performed around the country, so yeah, it's been my joy. It's been my joy.
Also doing internment stuff, Japanese American, Euro history, and
yes, my Japanese American family on my father's side came from Portland, Oregon. Now my mother's side's actually from Hawaii. My mother was born on Maui and lived on a sugar plantation for a few years, and then the family moved to Honolulu, and so she grew up in Honolulu. My father's family was from Portland, Oregon, and when he finished college and couldn't find work on the West Coast, he went to Hawaii, where there was work, and met my mother. But meanwhile, the war came, and his parents, my grandparents, and his sisters and brother were put into an incarceration camp in Tule Lake, and later Minidoka. And so about 10 years ago, my parents, well, actually, my own parents weren't in camp because they were in Hawaii. So it was my grandparents, and by then everyone was gone 10 years ago, except one aunt, my father's older sister. She was 91 years old, and I interviewed her at length and did a lot of research and developed a story about my family, their immigration from Japan, and their experience in the war years and what camp was like. And now I do that story, and I've actually developed a slideshow to go along with it, because because I do it with students a lot, and it's very difficult for them to imagine the incarceration camp. It's so foreign to their experience. And so I have photographs from my family and from the National Archives to go along with my story.
What little I know of the story of the World War II and the Japanese American community here in Hawaii was that if they had interned everyone that was Japanese American for fear that they had allegiances to Japan, there would be nobody to work.
Right, the economy of the islands would have
Shut
fallen
down.
apart. Right.
So instead of incarcerating everyone that was Japanese American, they just took the leaders, the language teachers, the heads of the dojos and the
Buddhist priests
temples, and incarcerated them either here locally. I know there was one camp in the middle of Oahu, and they also sent some to the mainland, from what I understand. So. Well, there's another story. We're not dwelling on those particularly, but I just wanted to share that because that's part of your background and part of your history. Do you have other stories that you came to share with us here?
I do. I have a couple more from Japan. I do tell stories from around the world, but of course I have a special fondness for Asian stories. It's a way for me to be in touch with my own heritage, and I'm asked to tell Asian stories because of who I am.
And that's in Chicago, your hometown.
Yes, I was born and raised in Chicago, and I live in Illinois now. Right.
Here she is with more stories from Japan, in Hawaii, for you, wherever you are, Anne Shimojima.
Thank you.
A hand.
This next story is also an old folk tale. I call it The Man with the Bump. Once, a long time ago, there was a man who was a woodcutter. He lived with his wife in a little house next to the forest where he would go and cut wood every day. Now, the woodcutter was a good, kind man, but he had this great big bump on one side of his face, on his right cheek. He hadn't always had that bump. When he was a young man, he'd been quite handsome, but one day that bump started to grow. He'd gone to all sorts of doctors. He'd tried lotions and potions. He'd gone to the priests at the temple. He'd even prayed to the gods. But that bump just kept getting bigger and bigger until it looked like a giant ball hanging from his cheek. He decided he would just have to get used to it. One day, the woodcutter picked up his axe and went into the forest as usual. He found the perfect tree, not too big, not too small, nice and straight. He took his axe and started chopping the tree down. But suddenly, the sky grew dark. The thunder rumbled, the raindrops began to fall. Well, he couldn't work in the rain, so he looked around, and there was an opening in the forest, a clearing. And on the other side, a very large tree with a hole in it, large enough to hold a man. So the woodcutter ran across the clearing and got into the hole in the tree and waited. After about an hour, the rain slowed. He was just about to step out of the tree when he heard noises. And he looked, and coming into the clearing on the other side, he saw, well, he had to look, it was so amazing. It was a group of storm spirits, demons, supernatural creatures, all out because it was a storm. They all had horns on their heads, claws on the ends of their fingers. The king of the storm spirits sat down right next to the tree the woodcutter was hiding in. He hardly dared to breathe or even move. The king said, "Let us have some dancing." And all the storm spirits started stomping around. They weren't very good dancers. And the king said, "I wish we had a really good dancer to dance for us." Well, when the woodcutter heard that, he couldn't help himself. He loved to dance, better than almost anything else in the world. He grabbed his fan, jumped into the middle of the clearing, and began to dance. Woo! The storm spirits were a little surprised to see a human in their midst, but they couldn't take their eyes off his dancing. He danced for an hour, for two. Finally, he was so tired he had to stop. The king said, "That was good. Will you come back and dance for us tomorrow?" And the woodcutter had had a fine time. He said, "Yes, I'll come back tomorrow." The king said, "We should take something from this human to make sure he returns." So all the storm spirits walked around the woodcutter, looked at him up and down, but he was a poor man. He didn't have anything of value. His clothes were all torn and tattered. And then the king pointed to his bump and said, "You see that bump? I have heard that bumps like that give humans good luck. We'll take the bump." He clapped his hands, and the bump disappeared. The woodcutter felt his face. The bump was gone. He was so excited, he ran home that minute. When his wife saw him, she said, "How did you get rid of your bump?" And he told her how he had danced for the storm spirits. They were so happy. They celebrated that night. They had a feast. They sang songs. They made so much noise, the neighbor next door heard them and came over to see what was going on. Now, the neighbor was a mean, greedy man. And strange to say, he had a bump too. He had a big bump on his left cheek. So when he saw the woodcutter's bump was gone, he said, "How'd you get rid of your bump?" And the woodcutter told him how he had danced for the storm spirits. And he said, "I'm going back to dance for them tomorrow." "No, you're not," said the neighbor. "I'll go back in your place. Maybe they'll take my bump." Well, the woodcutter was so kind-hearted. He said, "Yes, yes, you go in my place." And he told the neighbor exactly where to go. So the next day, it was the neighbor who went into the forest. Sure enough, the sky grew dark. The thunder rumbled. The raindrops began to fall. He looked around, and there was that big tree with the hole in it. He ran across the clearing, got into the hole, and waited. After a while, the rain slowed. He looked, and there were the storm spirits coming into the clearing. The king sat down next to his tree. The king said, "Let us have some dancing." And all the storm spirits started stomping around. The king said, "Where is that human? He promised to come back and dance for us today." The neighbor said, "Oh, here I am." He grabbed his fan, jumped into the middle of the clearing, and began to dance. He was a terrible dancer. He was awkward and clumsy. He stumbled around. He even fell down a few times. The king said, "Ooh, go home. And here, take your bump with you." And he threw the bump, and it landed right on the neighbor's right cheek. The neighbor went home. For the rest of his life, he had 2 bumps, but the woodcutter lived happily to the end of his days.
Well, Anne, I'm so sorry to have to say this. We're running out of time. But you've still gotten more than you ever paid for. You had the wisdom to come to ThinkTech Hawaii and hear some stories. Anne Shimojima, thank you for coming all the way from Chicago to Hawaii to tell some stories.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
You're all invited back to ThinkTech Hawaii anytime you want. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.